Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Nicolas Cage tries to survive the night against a group of murderous animatronics in this belated review of Willy's Wonderland. A mute drifter played by Nicolas Cage is driving through the small town of Hayesville when his tyres are punctured and his car breaks down. Stranded with no money to pay for the repair, the drifter agrees to work overnight as a janitor at the abandoned children's entertainment centre Willy's Wonderland, owned by Tex McAdoo played by Rick Wright, who will pay to fix the car by morning in exchange. But as the janitor gets to work, he soon discovers that Willy's Wonderland has a dark past, and that the animatronics are possessed by the spirits of murderous killers. But they've met their match in the form of the janitor. Willy's Wonderland is written by Joe Parsons. Back in 2016, Parsons made a short film called Willy's Wonderland. You'll note the slight title tweak there, which is basically this film in a 4-minute form, with Parsons himself playing the janitor character fighting against an animatronic bear at a children's entertainment centre. Parsons was reportedly not especially happy with the short and decided to remake it, but expand it out to feature length in the process. It's that script that ended up on the Blood List, which is the horror film equivalent of the famous Blacklist, the list of the most liked unproduced screenplays. It was there it caught the attention of Nicolas Cage, who was especially drawn to the protagonist character of the janitor because he had no spoken dialogue, and Cage always wanted to play a horror film character that was silent. Willy's Wonderland, the film, is directed by Kevin Lewis, and this is by far the most famous credit that he's known for. In fact, it's his first in well over a decade. During post-production on the movie, he contracted COVID-19, and it very nearly took his life just weeks before the film's release. Luckily, of course, he survived, and I can only congratulate him for that. Once the trailers for Willy's Wonderland arrived, it drew instant cult status, not just for Cage's presence, of course, but also for certain similarities to a well-known video game property, and we'll get to that in just a second. But the question is, does the film live up to the cult hype? Of course, the reason why Willy's Wonderland drew so much pre-release attention is that virtually everyone noticed how uncannily similar it was to the Five Nights at Freddy's video game series, except instead of centering on a security guard, it's on a janitor, but otherwise, it's a survive the night scenario set in a children's entertainment centre. And believe me, Willy's Wonderland makes no secret of its obvious inspiration. In fact, it gladly revels in that. It pretty much is an unofficial adaptation of the game, but only marginally tweaked to make it legally distinguishable and not tread on the game's copyrights. I'm assuming that lawyers picked through the script very carefully. Reportedly, they did actually have to change the script because what was called upon there was too close to the copyrighted characters in the game, so they had to come up with their own alternatives. But, you know, this isn't the first time that Five Nights at Freddy's has been completely ripped off. Of course, just in 2019, we had the very odd The Banana Splits movie, which took the Hanna-Barbera characters and ran them through the Five Nights at Freddy's mould. And I do have to say, having seen both those movies, I like Willy's Wonderland a lot more than the Banana Splits movie. I found the Banana Splits movie to actually be quite mean-spirited and unpleasant. It seemed to really kind of linger on the gore, the kills seemed overly protracted, and the dark humour was basically, isn't it funny watching small children being traumatised by kill scenes? Well, no, not really, to be honest. I find that actually just a little bit uncomfortable and unpleasant to sit through, but hey, that's just me. By comparison, Willy's Wonderland doesn't really try to go for any kind of edgelord comedy like that. It just tries to keep it simple, basically. And while I'll probably leave the comparisons to Five Nights at Freddy's to those that are actually more familiar with video games, it is pretty obvious exactly what it's trying to do, and I think that by the time that Five Nights at Freddy's does actually get a film adaptation, and supposedly Chris Columbus is actually working on one, it's gonna feel old hat because already it's been ripped off twice before it reaches the screen, and it wasn't exactly the most novel or original premise in the first place. But just so that we're absolutely on the same page, Willy's Wonderland is basically the closest thing you'll see to a live-action fanfic. It's basically, what if you were playing Five Nights at Freddy's, but as a total badass, and that badass was Nicolas Cage? That's basically it. That's the entire selling point. Now let's get into that conversation about Nicolas Cage. Nicolas Cage, ever since his well-publicised tax troubles, has definitely worked a lot. It seems like there's about 6 Cage movies a year, at least, but he's veered between obvious passion projects and obvious paychecks. And Cage has a very unusual taste in projects. He definitely follows his own mojo, which combines with his very expressionistic acting style, as he describes it. He goes for very off-the-wall choices at times, and that can easily be snipped out of context, popped together in a supercut for everyone to be entertained by. And I've seen plenty of those Cage performances. They are indeed entertaining, if a little bit inappropriate sometimes for the films they're in. But I think that can also diminish him as an actor, because while he can be that guy, he can also be quite a sensitive performer at the same time. He of course won an Oscar for his role in Leaving Las Vegas, but I feel like a lot of people kind of dismiss that and overlook it in favour of Cage just being that guy. And while I think Cage has kind of embraced that, I mean, you have to accept a role like you do in this movie, I also feel a bit conflicted about that. I do feel like Cage has more to offer than just simply being a meme, which is basically what he's in threat of becoming. He's in threat of becoming a caricature of himself, which wasn't entirely grounded to begin with. It's a very peculiar situation for an actor to find himself in, and I will say that Cage, whenever I've seen him in anything, he always looks like he's really committed to the project. He will follow it wherever it goes. And certainly, I'm not questioning Cage's determination, but Willy's Wonderland really doesn't ask anything of him other than just be present, to be there dressed in a leather jacket and glower through his sunglasses. It's a really kind of knowing stunt casting that basically, because the character has no real kind of backstory, no real motivation other than fixing his car, he's really just playing a cipher. I mean, the fact that Cage is playing a silent character is actually a little bit to its detriment, because that kind of diminishes what the audience for this film wants to see. When they see Cage in this kind of environment, they're expecting a wild and crazy Cage performance. And yet Cage actually kind of subverts that by being so quiet and actually fairly understated for a lot of the running time. He basically shows up and cleans for a large chunk of the film. You do get flashes of that intensity, especially when he first confronts the animatronics and he's got that twinkle in his eye. But it's only sporadic moments throughout, and it feels like he's actually more restricted by the fact that his character is mute, and doesn't really actually build a characterization through his performance that feels consistent. You don't get a true characterization here that would make up for the fact that he can't actually talk. And so there is this kind of void in the film. And honestly, if I was being a little bit mean, I would actually describe it as being the first performance by Nicolas Cage, the meme, in that it is basically calling upon audiences' self-awareness of Nicolas Cage, of the fact that he is that wild and crazy guy they've seen in all the supercuts. What you get out of Cage here could maybe be equalled by a guy just wearing a paper Nicolas Cage mask over his face. But maybe I so keenly felt that because aside from the premise and the casting, there really isn't that much to Willy's Wonderland. It's unsurprising that it's adapted from a short because it feels like a thin joke premise overextended to make it to feature length, and in the process of the latter, the script really doesn't add that much meat onto the bones. There's a small town conspiracy that is obvious from the moment the movie opens and plays out in very predictable fashion if you've even remotely seen a horror film like this, and the supporting characters don't pick up the slack. They don't fill the space where Cage's lack of dialogue is. They largely just exist to just talk to him, to deliver huge, great exposition dumps. There's at least 3 sequences in this movie that are really lengthy just to fill in the backstory of what's going on, told to Cage, who looks like he couldn't care less about what's being told to him. But it's largely for the sake of the audience and to draw out the running time ever further. And so, in that sense, it feels like Willy's Wonderland is both overstretched and underdeveloped. The supporting characters don't actually play that much of a role in the movie. The film introduces this whole bunch of supporting teenagers that also break into Willy's Wonderland. They're led by Emily Tosta's Liv, who wants to burn the place down. That's how we are first introduced to her, and there are of course subsequent reveals as to why she wants to do that. But aside from Tosta, those other characters, all played by actors of a questionable ability to say the least, are largely just there to bulk out the body count and are whittled through extremely quickly. None of them are really given all that much time in the film. They discard them as quickly as possible. And even Tosta, who is the female lead in the film, is actually sidelined for the virtually entire third act. That means that Willy's Wonderland is barely even a slasher movie, and I would argue it's not much of a horror film in general. It's got a couple of jump scares in it, but that's about it. And that's largely because of the character that Cage is playing. His janitor is so stoic, he's completely unfazed by everything that he confronts. Not even in that very first encounter does he seem wrong-footed. He actually seems to be taking it completely in his stride, and he takes on the animatronics with a fair bit of ease, if I'm being perfectly honest. It never feels like the character is in any real jeopardy. It never feels like he's actually going to get properly hurt by them. There's no real sense of menace to the animatronics. They never feel threatening because of this, and that's not just applicable to Cage either. Liv, at one point, gets tackled off screen by one of the animatronics, and then a few moments later just walks into another scene, having just dispatched it off screen with just a line of dialogue. I mean, come on, that just completely undermines the film. And I know it's not meant to be taking itself entirely seriously, but even so, you could have a couple of creepy moments. It doesn't feel like it makes full use of those characters, especially in the actual fight scenes, which a lot of them are just one-on-one encounters. It never seems like the animatronics really properly work together as a unit to try and take on Cage. You know, once they establish fairly early on that he is a credible threat to them, it basically seems like he's just going through the movie on God mode. The only time where it seems like he might actually have some element of danger is when he's in a 2-on-1 encounter. The movie fails to actually add any real stakes to the proceedings. I'm probably coming across as quite harsh on Willy's Wonderland, so I want to make clear that there were things about it that I quite liked. I think that on a technical level, it's a really well-made movie. It's very sharply edited, briskly paced, paced. At just under 90 minutes, it doesn't outstay its welcome, and in fact flies by a lot of the time. I also think the cinematography is really interesting. They use anamorphic lenses, so there's lots of lens flares, but also anamorphic lenses have this kind of distortion effect because of the curvature of them, and that means, in layman's terms, that at the very extreme ends of the frame, things start getting distorted and curved, and the filmmakers deliberately position characters in those areas so they kind of look like they're in a house of mirrors. It's kind of unsettling, the effect that has, and that adds to the kind of weird, bizarro feel. As well as the fact that it's an unofficial video game movie, I feel like the film, in a lot of ways, plays like a video game. You've got the protagonist character who doesn't speak, so that's the player character, the player avatar. But also, in various other ways, the film is structured in that each sequence is Cage's janitor going to another room and cleaning it and then fighting a boss. So each room becomes sort of like a level in its own right. And in between that, you've got this recurring thing where Cage, at the beginning of the movie, is told that he needs to take regular breaks. Like, if you're playing video games, you need to take regular breaks to rest your eyes. And so that means that Cage sets his watch, and every so often, he goes to the break room, pulls out a punch pop, which is his drink of choice, and plays on a pinball machine that he finds. And I guess the pinball machine and those sequences could kind of be construed as being like mini-games in their own ways. And so the character that Cage plays, he goes from each room or level. Every time he does that, and every time he fends off an animatronic, his shirt gets destroyed, but he finds another one to replace it with, so essentially the character resets between levels. And so that kind of subtle attempt at integrating that, maybe that's just me reading into something that wasn't meant to be there, but it definitely feels like that in terms of the structure, and it just feels like we're kind of going through the same scenario over and over again, but slightly changed each time. But in terms of actually watching it as a film, it means that you've got a protagonist that the audience doesn't really connect with emotionally or really just as a character in general, and also it does feel quite repetitive, just going through those same scenarios over and over again. In terms of being a cult item, I'm not actually sure how successful Willy's Wonderland is going to be at that. I always found myself wondering through the film, at what point is it going to actually ramp up to the movie that it should be? It always feels a bit too reserved and mild. I always expected it to go just that notch crazier, just that little notch wilder and stranger, and all the things that make cult movies so great. The reason why cult films build up their fan bases is because they have those moments that make an audience go, "Oh!" or go, "What the heck am I even watching?" Usually at the same time. They're the kind of movies that are best appreciated at a midnight screening, so you can share it with a whole bunch of audience members who are having exactly the same reaction or have seen it before and know exactly what's coming, and that's part of the fun. And that's what I felt was weirdly kind of lacking here. I didn't feel like I was having that much fun with Willy's Wonderland, and I wanted to. And there was this feeling in the back of my mind just sort of nibbling away at me in that it actually felt weirdly calculated. It feels like the kind of movie that strives to be a cult item but feels manufactured. It feels like this movie has that concept and it puts Nicolas Cage in it and expects that to do all the work for it. And that's not how a cult movie works. That's how Sharknado works. I think how much you'll like Willy's Wonderland really depends on how much Nicolas Cage in this premise can carry a movie for you. If that alone can get you to 80 minutes, then you'll probably have a good time with Willy's Wonderland. And it's nice that we have a silly movie that isn't taking itself seriously, especially in the times that we're going through. But also, I wish it was more than it actually was. If anything, to me, it felt like Willy's Wonderland didn't take full advantage of its potential. It feels really underutilised in its premise of Nicolas Cage, who doesn't have a character to play here, and honestly, just the script in general. It will definitely draw a lot of attention initially when it first comes out because of that pre-release hype, but I think once people start seeing the film, that will start dying down. I wish that the movie had more the courage of its convictions, but instead we only get brief flashes of it. You know, you get moments where Cage rips the spine out of an animatronic like a Mortal Kombat finisher. I wanted this movie to have that energy the entire time, and it simply doesn't. That being said though, if you're anticipating a Five Nights at Freddy's movie and can't wait for the real thing, this will probably tide you over for the time being. If you like this review, then you can buy me a punch pop over at my Ko-fi page, or you can throw me a party at my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.